Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Mariam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy. If you've been a longtime listener of this podcast, you'd know that Lexington does not have a shortage of stories to contribute to the true crime genre. But there is one murder mystery that not many people have heard of and has long been forgotten. It wasn't so much a mystery as to who did it, but why he did it. In the summer of 1897, July to be exact, one Jacob S. Harris shot and killed Thomas H. Merritt out in the open air of Gratz Park. Thomas Merritt was a widowed pension attorney that Jacob Harris believed was having an affair with his wife, Effie. What ensued was a sensational court case that had local and national newspaper readers enthralled. This story was brought to our attention by local real estate agent Zach Davis of Kirkpatrick Co. Zach earned his real estate license at the age of 18, shortly after he started at Transylvania University. Zach pursued a degree in history with a special interest in the historic architecture of the Bluegrass State. In addition to being a proud Central Kentuckian and successful horse farm broker, Zach enjoys genealogy research, Kentucky history, and local bourbon. Welcome, Zach. Thank you so much for doing the podcast with us.
Thank you, Mariam and Aaron. Big fan.
All right. So, Zach, you reached out to us about this amazing story that you found out about the Harrises from 1897, a bit of a murder mystery. Tell us how you came across it.
My wife, Natalie, and I enjoy Lexington history, but mostly we particularly enjoy finding stories that we didn't know about and that the majority of people today have no idea occurred. And once you find the start, it's impossible not to follow to the finish.
Yes.
And it was a headline in the July 10th, 1897 edition of the Daily Leader that just said tragedy. And as we got to reading, it mentioned Gratz Park, and we had to follow it through to its finish.
Of course. And your connection to Gratz Park is you're a real estate agent, a successful one. Congratulations on your on your recognition by Equestrian Living magazine recently. I know that they recognized you with your success, of course, in your real estate.
Thank you. Part
of your life. But one of your hobbies is history and local history research. So what thread did you kind of have to pull in order to learn more about the story?
We have a subscription to newspapers.com, which is worth every penny. And I forget what it was I had searched, what keyword, but it picked up. I saw the headline. And of course, I'm an alumni of Transylvania like Aaron. We were in the same class, actually. And so when I saw that, I saw Gratz Park.
There's a few murder mysteries around Lexington that everybody kind of knows about. We've done a lot of podcasts about them. So the story of the Harrises, where did they actually live around Gratz Park? What was their connection to Gratz Park?
They didn't live near Gratz Park, but Gratz Park was, like it is today, a place where people could gather and sit and socialize. It was a different Gratz Park than what you see today because at the time the lot was still owned by Transylvania University. And it was a subscription park. So it was surrounded with an iron fence. And actually the arch that you see in the park today next to the Carnegie Center, which was the Lexington Public Library, is a replica of the gates that would have been at each corner of Gratz Park.
Okay.
And so the events that ended up happening occurred because our unfortunate victim, after he left the office that day, walked up to Gratz Park to meet someone.
Who is Effie Harris.
Mrs. Effie
So
Harris.
Jacob Harris and Effie Harris were married.
They were married. And so to start, our victim is Thomas H. Merritt, and he was a 52-year-old widower working as a pension attorney in Lexington. And his office was on the corner of North Upper and Short, I'm almost certain. Mr. Harris was a 32-year-old traveling salesman for J.H. Sistrunk. And I had to look that up. That was a local fruit dealer here in Lexington. To begin, Thomas Merritt lived in the same boarding house as Jacob and Effie Harris, which at the time was 88 South Mill Street. Today, that is 330 South Mill, and remarkably, it's still standing. And of course, it wasn't uncommon at that time and into the well into the 20th century in downtown Lexington for what may have been a single-family residence to be converted to a duplex or a triplex, whatever it may be. So you would have several individuals or families living under one roof, but in their own units. Perhaps they shared bathroom facilities or something like that, but they were in the same house. 2 months prior to all of this, Effie begins working for Merritt as a copyist. And so, who knows, perhaps they would leave the house together every morning and walk to work. She would transcribe things for him in the day, perhaps greet people if they came into the office. Jacob, her husband, he believes the pair are becoming too close. They spend time together at work. Merritt would escort Effie home after work, and then he would again visit with her after supper. Jacob expressed this to Effie and really was becoming increasingly jealous and possessive and embarrassed. After the events unfolded, Effie told the Daily Leader that her marriage had not been a happy one. They spent most of it apart because of his temperament. She dismissed all of Jacob's suspicions as falsehoods, paranoia. In one account, she claims they were married when she was only 14. In another, she states that they were married when she was 15. Interestingly enough, her vital records have her being born in 1870, but of course that was a time where vital records could easily be fudged, or perhaps unknowingly a false date is repeated on a death certificate. The leader at the time reports that she was 23 years of age. Quote, 23 years of age, brunette, quite pretty when this happened. And that actually does line up with her account of being, because she was 23, this was 9 years after her marriage certificate was issued. So she was perhaps 14, very young. 15. Yeah.
So the incident obviously happened at the park. Effie and Merritt were together at the park, right?
Yes. The day it happened, Jacob decided he wanted to walk Effie home from work. And so he went to the office a little before closing. And as he approached the building, he saw Thomas Merritt walking out. And Merritt didn't see Jacob coming in. Jacob goes upstairs and he says he'd like to walk his wife home. He's told she's already left for the day. So he goes back outside, hoping to see Merritt, and he figures he'll follow him. And I guess his thought process was, Merritt will perhaps lead me to a rendezvous.
Yeah.
So Merritt's walking up Upper Street. He goes east on Church, turns left on Market towards the Benjamin Gratz Park. Jacob follows, but he keeps a distance. He doesn't want to be spotted. Merritt enters the park, and about midway up the park, Effie is sitting on a bench, presumably waiting on him.
Dun, dun, dun.
So Jacob, he walks west on 2nd Street and then goes up North Mill. He's standing behind a tree watching them, by his account, for several hours. According to Jacob, he observed Merritt and Effie kissing her, quote, removing his hat and gently stroking his hair. And when Effie sat on Merritt's lap, Jacob had had enough. So he entered the park's northwestern gates, which are at the corner of North Mill and West 3rd. He confronted them with a pistol drawn, and without warning, he fired directly at Merritt. A bullet struck Merritt's neck, and gunpowder burned his cheek, but he had the strength to flee towards the southwest park gates, which were at North Mill and West 2nd. But Jacob fired again. He struck Merritt a second time, through the back near the heart. Merritt fell and within seconds expired. Effie ran for her own well-being, exiting the park gates at the corner of Market and West 3rd. After Merritt fell, an eyewitness, there was one other person in the park, heard Jacob exclaim, "I have the damned son of a bitch at last." The witness was standing near the building we know today as the kitchen, which is the light blue, very old brick structure near the corner of Market Street and West 3rd. The witness sees Jacob walking towards him, pistol still in hand. Jacob asked the witness, "Have you seen anything of that damned woman?" The witness replied in the negative, and Jacob exited the park through the same gates he entered moments before. No one else was in the park at the time. So after all of this occurred, it didn't take Lexington police long to find their suspect. The owner of a boarding house where the Thomas Merritt and the Harrises lived previously pointed at Jacob with the disclaimer that it was actually Merritt who'd, quote, brought it all upon himself. So they were living in another boarding house.
Wow.
All under the same roof. And we'll never know, but you can speculate, did Jacob move his family out of that boarding house because perhaps they were getting a little too close? Did Merritt follow them to another boarding house? Well, we don't know. The police went to Jacob's house on South Upper, and after initially denying he was involved, he conceded, saying, quote, "You've got the right man, I did it." A coroner's inquest confirmed that Merritt had indeed perished from 2 gunshot wounds, but either would have been fatal on its own. His still living but very frail parents in Louisville were devastated. He had been visiting them a week earlier and remarked to his father that he, quote, "had a pretty woman as his stenographer." His father recalled Merritt saying, quote, "jokingly, he was almost in love with her." His father elaborated, "Although I took it that he was joking, I warned him to be careful in his conduct." The crime was sensational Lexington news in the summer of 1897, and the region's papers carried daily coverage. The bluegrass populace tended to exhibit empathy for Jacob. Murder was certainly wrong. However, Thomas Merritt's perceived seduction of a much younger woman, a wife, and a mother was abhorrent. Nevertheless, he was dead, and the coroner's inquest had completed and ruled it a murder. And what was called the police court at the day was called into session the following week with Judge Falconer presiding.
Yeah, so the police court is specific for these kinds of crimes back then?
All kinds. And of course, the Lexington and Kentucky's judicial structures in 1897 were certainly different from what we have today. Judge Falconer was a city judge, which is not exactly like a district or circuit judge that we would have in Fayette County in 2024. Judge Falconer was to oversee a reviewing trial, which would determine at his discretion whether Jacob should be subject to grand jury review and possible indictment on the charge of murder, or whether the charges should be dismissed altogether.
So after the crime happened, there was an article that discussed Effie Harris. Basically, she had disappeared actually after, so they were looking for her. But then they found her, and she was confined also to a county jail.
She was. They wanted to see if she had any role or if there was any contribution on her part to this scene, but ultimately she was released. But yes, she did go to, I believe, Louisville or Shelbyville for a little bit, maybe just to get out of town.
Mm-hmm. Just to escape the
a
hullabaloo, I guess
day or two, say, yeah. Because this all happened very quickly.
Yes, it seems like. Yeah.
Merritt was murdered on a Friday, and I think it's within 7 days you had a verdict.
Yeah.
It was a week.
I mean, the article was dated July 17th, 1897.
Yeah. I mean, it moved very quickly.
Very quickly. So talk to us a little bit about the trial and how it came about.
Sure. Judge Falconer called things to order. There was obviously very passionate testimony. The Commonwealth made several arguments that in his decision, Judge Falconer didn't necessarily agree with. One of their arguments was that Harris should have given Merritt fair warning before firing the shot. Yes. He should have given him a chance to leave his wife alone. And you can't help but think that maybe he did on numerous, maybe dozens of occasions, but in this instance, he did not give him any warning. And because of that, he should have been, the Commonwealth argued, indicted and gone to trial for murder. And interestingly enough, something else that I found, it wasn't long after the reviewing trial began that another woman, known to nobody in town, was daily in the courtroom, intently following the proceedings. According to the leader, she was, quote, young, apparently not more than 28, and of exceedingly comely face and figure. She was dressed modestly but stylishly, and had the appearance of being well-to-do. The leader learns that this was Miss Sophia Levy of Bloomington, Indiana, and she was Thomas Merritt's fiancée.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So her tasks in Lexington were to observe the trial and to collect 2 items of jewelry from Merritt's personal effects, a watch and a diamond pin. She came to Lexington after spending a week in Louisville grieving with her once future in-laws. She confirmed the rumors that she was Merritt's fiancée to a reporter in a very dignified manner, and this relationship was further evidenced by letters that the coroner found on Merritt in his pocket from her of a romantic nature. So it was established that she was indeed his fiancée from Bloomington, Indiana.
Oh, wow.
So the reviewing trial is called. It occurs pretty quickly, and Falconer's decision was handed down. The charges against Jacob S. Harris were dismissed. There was no question he fired the shots that ended Merritt's life, but as Judge Falconer determined, He did so on account of society's unwritten laws, namely that of a man's right to protect and defend his household, more particularly his children, against slander and slight due to the immoral actions of one parent.
So an unwritten law.
An unwritten law. It was more of a societal, I guess, standard that he had every right to do this to protect his family's honor.
The Harrises did have children.
They had 2 children at the time. They had 2 young children at the time.
So he was acquitted.
Mm-hmm.
And then...
Well, he wasn't even acquitted. He was dismissed.
Oh.
The judge said this does not warrant going before a jury of your peers.
See.
I do not believe that you have committed the crime of murder in that sense.
So there's no basis for a case, basically, is what he judged.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So then what? They just
it didn't end. One would think, but it did not end. But importantly, newspapers across the country had been following the trial, and the decision made front-page headlines. And Judge Falconer received many, many letters, both from near and afar, because of his basis of an unwritten law. Some of these letters were critical, but most praised his judgment.
Wow.
And thought he made the right decision. The Commonwealth, they weren't done. They obviously strongly disagreed. And so within 7 days, the grand jury is now investigating the murder. Things were quiet for Jacob and Effie for a bit. They reconciled. They were living on a house either on or off West High. They were on Spring Street, which is now under the, I believe, Rupp Arena parking lot. Initially, Effie was very obviously angry. She was saying she was going to file for divorce. She was very cold to him during the reviewing trial, not looking at him or staring at him in a very cold way. But after all of this, they did decide to reconcile. They were living again together on off West High. And things were quiet until December of that year, so about 5 months later. The December 16th edition of the Daily Leader reports that the grand jury has again met and is again considering charges against Harris. But apparently, 2 previous grand juries had met and declined to indict. So the Commonwealth, again, they're being pretty relentless on this. The Daily Leader reports that, quote, Harris's actions recently are probably the cause, but it doesn't elaborate. So was he causing trouble in public? Was he causing trouble in private? Should he and his family just left town after the charges were dismissed in July? The paper states that the, quote, indictment shows very conclusively that a mere examining trial and that discharge by an examining judge is no way to cease a judicial investigation. So they were very critical of the process as it was to occur at that time. So Harris is arrested. He's booked. He's able to post bond with his brother's help. And the family decides we are going to get out of town now. So they move to Louisville to await the second trial.
Wow.
Or what really the first trial.
Yeah, because there was no trial first. Yeah.
So the testimony in the second trial went much as it did in the first, though the Commonwealth was able to procure a few additional witnesses. They had some folks who were along North Mill, outside of the park, that were perhaps working for people who lived on North Mill. But it wasn't much. It was, I thought I saw, or I thought I heard, or
conjecture, but basically.
Obviously, it wasn't enough. But when both sides rested, the Judge Parker, gave the jury very specific instructions that they were to deliberate on the evidence presented and the laws of the Commonwealth, not any unwritten law.
Yeah, because that's how the Constitution was written.
So, according to the paper, the jury had the case for 24 hours, which they thought was a long time. And the thinking was, well, I suppose maybe they came out and said it. There were 2 jurors who were holding out for a while. They thought he should get 2 years for manslaughter. But the other vast majority, believed, for whatever reason, he should be found not guilty. And the Commonwealth's case was again found lacking because the jury returned a verdict of not guilty by temporary insanity on April 7th, after, again, 24 hours of deliberation. So after this second trial, the Harris family decided they were going to move again, and this time a little further away. They moved to Houston, Texas. And Jacob and Effie remained married and even had another child. He died at 68, followed by Effie 4 years later. By all accounts, they lived a quiet life afterwards, and even a passing mention of either name in local papers is very difficult to find. Following the second dismissal of charges, Thomas Merritt was only occasionally mentioned in local papers, and typically when another judge in another state cited Falconer's unwritten law principle as precedent for a decision they were about to make. For his part, Thomas Merritt is buried in an unmarked grave in Louisville's Cave Hill Cemetery.
Oh, wow.
And here we are, more than a century later, still talking about it.
That's incredible. This is the wonderful thing about archiving newspapers, is that you catch a thread and you keep pulling and then you don't know where it leads. What have you ever come across doing research, reading newspaper articles?
How many podcasts do you want to do? As my wife would say, don't get him started.
This is why we do the podcast, is for researchers like you. We found that a lot of patrons that come visit the Kentucky Room have really interesting research. They found all kinds of treasures, and we wanted them to be able to share it with our community listeners, whether they live here in Kentucky or across the country or even overseas. So I love it when our customers say, we found this story. Have you ever heard of it? And we're like, no, let's do a podcast. So I'm always intrigued by what we can find in the newspapers or estate books or multiple resources that you can just, pull threads from. Mm-hmm. So we've had customers write fiction books, and some customers that will write nonfiction or just, do research just for the love of it. So is that what drives you, is just for the love of it, or what?
It's entirely a passion, a hobby. And I mean, if you didn't enjoy it, it at times could be so tedious trying to find that one missing link, whatever it may be. Fortunately, I really enjoy, if I like to walk a lot downtown, and if I see a house that I find intriguing, I'll just take a picture of it and then start digging through the legal records and again, newspapers.com. And that was an era where everything was in the paper. They put everything in the paper. And it's really unfortunate, the state of newspapers today. But back then, everything was in it. And I'm so glad we have so many archived. And I love our Fayette County Clerk, Susan Lamb. They have digitized and continue to digitize so many of the legal records that we have in the clerk's office. And they have the early records now pretty much fully digitized. So they used to see me coming and scatter, but now I can just do it from my house.
Yeah. That's the nice thing about digitizing these kinds of records is, it can continue your story and try to, answer questions for you, or maybe create even more. And that's when you go down a big rabbit hole. You're a local guy.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about homes in Lexington that kind of triggers this drive to learn more about its history? We kind of pride ourselves as an up-and-coming city. We're very modern and trying to attract even more big companies to come to Lexington. But there is something about locals that are still tied to the history of this city and the surrounding area. And that intrigues me. I mean, I grew up in Lexington. I'm not necessarily a native. I came here in 1986. But there's something about people that have grown up here for generations that ties them to the city, the history of it. And they're always looking and seeking the history behind every single corner of the city. What is it about Lexington?
Lexington has done that to people for 250 years, even when it was a brand new, in essence, fort. Something about central Kentucky has really captivated people for many thousands of years, considering the native occupants and burial ground. And it's just a very interesting place to be. And I don't know, when I see a house that's built of brick or stone, I think of the person whose hand touched that brick to lay it. And then I think of all the people that were born in that house, that perhaps died in that house, that had wonderful occasions, terrible things happen in that house. And so again, just taking a picture today with my iPhone, I become very, in many ways, connected to someone who may have died 180 years ago. But I see them and now they see me, and it's very interesting.
Yeah. And on that note, keep researching, keep finding different stories to share with us. It's a fascinating story. I wonder about their children and where they are and and where they went and who their
Give me 15
offspring,
minutes.
who their offspring are. And so, again, a rabbit hole.
Right, it really
but we
is.
love it, and we love sharing this type of research. Thank you so much. You've been listening to Zach Davis telling us the story of the Harris family and the murder of Thomas Merritt. Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm, or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Mariam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane.